Richard Nixon, the Controlled Substances Act, and the War on Drugs. Had the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 succeeded in permanently stamping out the recreational use of pot, none of you would be reading this book right now. Of course, as we all know, the lid could only be kept on the pot for so long. In the mid-1960s, some 30 years after the passage of federal pot prohibition, a whole new generation of young people, mostly college-aged students, began altering their consciousness with marijuana. Some viewed the use of cannabis as a rejection of the establishment and the culture of their parents' generation. Others viewed marijuana consumption as a form of political protest and civil disobedience against U.S. foreign policy in Vietnam. And some simply discovered that they preferred the relaxing and conscious expanding effects of marijuana over alcohol. This explosion of pot use in the 1960s was quickly followed by a proportional rise in pot arrests, which ballooned from just over 10,000 a year in the early part of the decade to more than 100,000 per year by the end of the decade. Most of those arrested faced severe penalties, including mandatory sentences of several years to, in some cases, decades in jail. As marijuana arrests and prosecutions swelled, those convicted were no longer limited primarily to ethnic minorities like African Americans and Hispanics, the groups state and federal politicians had initially targeted decades earlier. Predictably, as more white, middle-class, otherwise law-abiding young people were caught up in the system, politicians began facing increasing pressure to review their multi-decade-long pot policies. Many state legislators began revamping their marijuana laws, reducing simple pot possession offenses from felonies to criminal misdemeanors. By 1970, even members of Congress felt compelled to act. Following a series of hearings in 1969, during which experts estimated that between 8 and 12 million Americans were likely using the drug recreationally, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. This comprehensive legislation eliminated mandatory minimum drug sentences. Congress eventually reinstated them in the 1980s, reduced pot penalties, and established federal scheduling criteria for illicit and licit substances. Of the 5 schedules established under the United States Controlled Substances Act, the most restrictive was dubbed Schedule 1. Drugs classified in the Schedule 1 category, like heroin and LSD, remained prohibited under all circumstances because they, by law, were defined to possess no currently accepted medical use, a high potential for abuse, and a lack of accepted safety. In 1970, members of Congress begrudgingly categorized marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug, but with a caveat. The classification was only supposed to be temporary. That's because the Controlled Substances Act also called for the creation of a special federal commission to study all aspects of the cannabis plant, its use, and its users. Once and for all, Congress was going to determine whether there was any truth to the claims that pot was a dangerous drug deserving of strict prohibition. After nearly 2 years of scientific study, Congress's Marijuana Commission, known as the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, completed its investigation. The multi-million-dollar study was trumpeted as the most comprehensive study of marijuana ever made in the United States. The Commission's report, entitled Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding, was issued to Congress and President Richard Nixon on March 22, 1972. In clear and unambiguous language, it rebutted virtually every negative claim that politicians and members of law enforcement had ever made about the drug's alleged dangers. It reported, "Looking only at the effects of the individual, there is little proven danger of physical or psychological harm from the experimental or intermittent use of the natural preparations of cannabis. Marijuana clearly is not in the same chemical category as heroin insofar as its physiologic and psychological effects are concerned. In a word, cannabis does not lead to physical dependence." The incidence of psychiatric hospitalizations for acute psychoses and of use of drugs other than alcohol is not significantly higher than among the non-using population. These findings are somewhat surprising in view of the widespread belief that cannabis attracts the mentally unstable, vulnerable individual. The fact should be emphasized that the overwhelming majority of marijuana users do not progress to other drugs. No substantial evidence existed of a causal connection between the use of marijuana and the commission of violent or aggressive acts. Rather than inducing violent or aggressive behavior through its purported effects of lowering inhibitions, weakening impulse control, and heightening aggressive tendencies, marijuana was usually found to inhibit the expression of aggressive impulses by pacifying the user. Speaking before Congress, the Commission's chairperson, Republican Governor Raymond P. Schaefer of Pennsylvania, concluded, "The recommendations of the Commission is that we do not feel that private use or private possession of marijuana in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalization, and that the people who experiment with marijuana should not be criminalized for that particular behavior." This policy recommendation, known as decriminalization, called for Congress to eliminate all criminal penalties punishing the private possession of cannabis, as well as those restricting non-profit transactions of the drug. In place of these penalties, the Commission suggested that Congress impose sanctions of no more than a nominal fine for the use and possession of marijuana. The Commission further recommended that cannabis no longer be classified as a Schedule I drug under federal law. While some in Congress were willing to take the Commission's findings under advisement, President Nixon immediately made it clear that he would do no such thing. Privately, legend has it that he tossed the report in the trash without ever reading it. Publicly, he took to the airwaves to announce, "I shall continue to oppose efforts to legalize marijuana." In fact, in the months following the publication of the Schaefer report, Nixon did the exact opposite of what the Commission had recommended. Flexing the federal muscle of the newly formed anti-crime super agency, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, Nixon announced that his administration was launching the first official war on drugs. Public enemy number one, you guessed it, marijuana. Under Nixon's watch, annual marijuana-related arrests rose from 119,000 in 1969 when Nixon took office to 445,000 in 1974 when he resigned from office. And the war on pot still rages today.